Chapter 1. Before there was a crime scene, before there was a nickname, before there was a body turned into spectacle, there was a young woman trying to build a life in a country that had just come out of war and did not yet know what to do with people like her. Elizabeth Short was born on July 29, 1924, in Hyde Park, Massachusetts. She was the third of 5 daughters in a family that would never be stable for long. Her father, Cleo Short, disappeared during the Great Depression after abandoning his car on a bridge, leading the family to believe he had died by suicide. Years later, Elizabeth would learn that he had survived and started a new life in California. That early rupture mattered. It shaped how she understood permanence, trust, and survival. Elizabeth's childhood was marked by illness and instability. She suffered from severe asthma and bronchitis, conditions serious enough that doctors advised her mother to send her to Florida during winters to improve her health. This pattern of being sent away, living temporarily with others, became a recurring structure in her life. She learned early how to be transient without calling it that. She was described by those who knew her as quiet, polite, and careful. Not reckless, not wild. That portrayal would come later, imposed after her death. In life, Elizabeth Short was cautious, often guarded, and acutely aware of how precarious her situation was. She worked when she could, relied on acquaintances when she had to, and tried to position herself close to opportunity without being consumed by it. In 1943, she was arrested briefly for underage drinking at Camp Cook near Santa Barbara, where she was visiting an Army Air Force officer she was dating. The incident was minor, but it would later be exaggerated into evidence of moral failure. At the time, it was simply a reminder of how closely women were watched, judged, and recorded, even for trivial behavior. Elizabeth was drawn west by a combination of factors that were common in the 1940s. California represented health, reinvention, and possibility. Hollywood loomed large, but not always in the way later accounts suggest. There is no solid evidence that she was a serious aspiring actress in the professional sense. She did not have an agent. She did not hold roles. What she had was proximity, hope, and the belief that being near the industry might lead to something better than what she had left behind. Her relationships during this period were often misunderstood. She dated servicemen. She relied on friends. She accepted help when it was offered. This was not promiscuity, it was survival. Post-war Los Angeles was crowded with men returning from service, women displaced by wartime labor shifts, and a housing market that could not absorb them all. Couch surfing, hotel hopping, and informal arrangements were common, especially for young women without family support. Elizabeth Short moved frequently. Florida, Massachusetts, California, back and forth. Each move left fewer anchors behind. By the time she returned to Los Angeles in 1946, she was living almost entirely on the margins, not destitute, but vulnerable, dependent on short-term solutions. Invisible in a city full of people just like her. This matters because the version of Elizabeth Short that would later dominate headlines was a distortion. The press would depict her as reckless, immoral, and careless with her safety. That narrative made the crime easier to explain and easier to dismiss. A fallen woman, a bad outcome, a cautionary tale. The reality was more uncomfortable. Elizabeth Short was not reckless. She was precarious. She did not court danger. She lived with it because she had few alternatives. Her life was shaped by illness, abandonment, economic instability, and a culture that offered young women limited paths to security. In Episode 1, we examined how her death became a spectacle and how the investigation unraveled almost immediately. In this episode, we begin the harder work, reconstructing a life that was flattened by violence and rewritten by others. Elizabeth Short did not begin as a mystery. She began as a person, and understanding that person is essential to understanding everything that followed. This is AI True Crime, and today it's the Black Dahlia Part 2, Elizabeth Short. Chapter 2. By the time Elizabeth Short reached her early 20s, her life had settled into a pattern that would later be misrepresented as aimlessness, but was, in reality, a series of calculated adaptations. She lived in a country that offered young women few stable paths if they lacked money, family support, or marriage. Elizabeth had none of those in reliable supply. What she did have was an ability to move, to negotiate space temporarily, and to remain outwardly composed while living with constant uncertainty. Her health continued to shape her choices. Asthma was not a minor inconvenience in the 1940s. It limited where she could work, how long she could exert herself, and where she could live safely. Cold weather worsened her condition, which partly explains her repeated returns to California. This was not wanderlust. It was a search for physical survivability. California promised warm air, medical access, and distance from a family structure that had already fractured beyond repair. Elizabeth's relationship with men during this period has been relentlessly distorted. She was often in the company of servicemen, but context matters. The wartime and post-war years produced a massive population of young men in uniform, many of them transient themselves, passing through bases, hospitals, and temporary housing. These men were not a subculture. They were the social environment. Dating them did not mark Elizabeth as reckless. It marked her as normal. One relationship in particular would later be mythologized. Elizabeth had been romantically involved with Major Matthew Michael Gordon Jr., an Army Air Force officer who died in a plane crash in India in 1945. This loss mattered. Those who knew Elizabeth later described her as deeply affected by Gordon's death, more so than the press ever acknowledged. Grief does not always manifest dramatically. Sometimes it simply removes whatever illusion of stability a person was clinging to. After Gordon's death, Elizabeth drifted further from permanence. She lived briefly with friends, stayed in rooming houses, and spent time in hotels that charged by the week. She relied on acquaintances, not because she was irresponsible, but because formal leases and long-term arrangements were beyond her reach. A young woman without steady income or family backing had few options, and most of them carried risk. Her interactions with law enforcement were minimal and unremarkable, but they would later be inflated into character judgments. The 1943 arrest for underage drinking near Camp Cook became a cornerstone of posthumous moralizing, as if a single minor infraction defined her life. At the time, it barely registered. After her death, it was transformed into evidence of deviance. Elizabeth's appearance also became a tool for distortion. She was widely described as striking, with dark hair and careful grooming. Newspapers would later use this to suggest vanity or manipulation. In reality, presentation was one of the few forms of control available to her. Looking put together was not about seduction. It was about dignity and self-protection in a society that treated visibly vulnerable women as disposable. By 1946, Elizabeth Short was back in Los Angeles. She had no permanent address. She moved between locations that offered temporary shelter, often staying just long enough not to overstay her welcome. She was careful, according to those who knew her, about imposing on others. She understood how thin her margins were. This version of Elizabeth Short is harder to turn into a headline. She was not reckless. She was not careless. She was navigating a system that offered little forgiveness and even less stability. Her life was a sequence of short-term solutions strung together in the hope that something more durable might eventually appear. Understanding this matters because it reframes everything that follows. Elizabeth Short did not wander into danger blindly. She lived in a state of managed risk, shaped by illness, loss, and economic precarity. Her vulnerability was structural, not moral. In the next chapter, we will narrow the lens further. We will examine Elizabeth Short's final months in Los Angeles, the people she stayed with, the places she passed through, and the fragile routines she relied on. Not as a mystery, but as a life unfolding toward an end no one could see coming. Chapter 3. In the final months of Elizabeth Short's life, the geography of Los Angeles mattered as much as the people she encountered. This was a city stretched thin by war and return. Veterans flooded back faster than housing could be built. Rooming houses overflowed. Hotels operated on weekly rates and informal arrangements. Stability was a luxury, and Elizabeth lived without it. By mid-1946, she was moving between short stays, rarely remaining in one place long enough to become rooted. This pattern has often been framed as irresponsibility. In reality, it reflected the fragile etiquette of dependence. Staying too long risked becoming a burden. Leaving too quickly risked isolation. Elizabeth walked that line constantly, managing impressions as carefully as she managed her limited resources. She spent time in Hollywood, not as an actress with prospects, but as someone orbiting an industry that promised opportunity without offering access. Hollywood in the 1940s was not a meritocracy. It was a gate-kept ecosystem dominated by contracts, studios, and men with power. Elizabeth had proximity, not entry. That distinction is crucial. Being near Hollywood did not mean being protected by it. Accounts from those who encountered her during this period describe someone reserved and polite, not reckless or impulsive. She was careful about where she went and with whom. She avoided bars when she could. She was conscious of reputation, aware that a single accusation could close doors permanently. This caution did not make her safe, it made her invisible. Her financial situation remained precarious. She worked sporadically, often relying on friends or acquaintances for meals and temporary shelter. This was common among young women in post-war Los Angeles, though rarely acknowledged openly. The city functioned through informal networks of favors and short-term hospitality. Elizabeth was part of that hidden economy, one built on goodwill that could evaporate without warning. She also maintained correspondence with family back east, carefully editing her life in letters. She emphasized optimism. She downplayed instability. This was not deception so much as self-preservation. Admitting how fragile her circumstances were would have meant admitting failure, and Elizabeth resisted that quietly, persistently. As the year turned toward winter, her movements became more compressed. She stayed closer to downtown Los Angeles and Hollywood, cycling through familiar locations. Some people remembered her vividly, others barely registered her presence. This uneven visibility would later haunt the investigation. Too many people knew her casually, too few knew her well. Elizabeth's final weeks were marked by routine rather than drama. She met friends, she stayed overnight in borrowed spaces, she moved on when necessary. There is no evidence that she anticipated danger or expressed fear of a specific individual. What she lived with instead was a generalized awareness of vulnerability, a constant background condition rather than a moment of panic. This matters because it resists the idea of a single fatal mistake. Elizabeth Short's life did not spiral toward disaster through one reckless decision. It narrowed gradually under structural pressure. Illness limited her options. Economic instability restricted her choices. Social expectations constrained her movements. Each factor alone was survivable. Together, they formed a trap. In the days before her death, Elizabeth was seen, spoken to, and remembered imperfectly. She existed in fragments across the city. That fragmentation would later allow others to reshape her story, filling gaps with assumption and judgment. The press would treat those gaps as evidence of moral failure. Investigators would struggle to turn them into timelines. What Elizabeth Short's final months reveal is not recklessness, but endurance. She survived through attentiveness, adaptability, and restraint. She navigated a city that offered little protection to women like her and asked for silence in return. In the next chapter, we move closer to the final days. We examine Elizabeth Short's last known movements, the confirmed encounters, the disputed sightings, and the thin line between what can be verified and what has been imagined since. Chapter 4. The final days of Elizabeth Short's life are among the most contested, distorted, and emotionally loaded portions of the Black Dahlia case. They are also the most revealing, not because they offer certainty, but because they show how easily a real person can dissolve into rumor when documentation is thin and attention is intense. In early January 1947, Elizabeth was still moving through Los Angeles in the way she had for months. She stayed briefly with acquaintances, relied on informal hospitality, and avoided settling anywhere long enough to invite scrutiny or obligation. This constant motion has often been described as drifting. In reality, it was a defensive strategy. Rootlessness offered a kind of safety. It limited what others could demand of her and what she owed in return. One of the last confirmed locations where Elizabeth stayed was the home of friends in the Hollywood area. Accounts from these acquaintances describe her as calm, courteous, and eager not to overstay her welcome. She helped with chores, she kept to herself. She spoke about plans in vague but hopeful terms. There is no record of panic, fear, or conflict in these interactions. Nothing that suggested she believed she was in immediate danger. Her last clearly documented sighting occurred on January 9, 1947, when she was seen at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. This moment has taken on enormous significance, partly because it is one of the few points in her final timeline that can be anchored with relative confidence. She was observed using the lobby telephone. She was well-dressed. She appeared composed. After that, the record fractures. What follows is a blur of claimed sightings, second-hand reports, and retroactive certainty. People came forward after her death claiming to have seen her alive days later. Some said she had been at bars. Others insisted she had stayed overnight with them. A few claimed she had confided fears or suspicions. Many of these accounts contradicted one another. Some were clearly influenced by newspaper coverage. Others may have been sincere misrememberings shaped by time and attention. Investigators struggled to impose order on this chaos. Each claim had to be evaluated, but few could be confirmed. Elizabeth Short lived a life that left minimal documentation, no permanent address, no employment records tying her to a specific location, no consistent social circle that could account for her movements day by day. This absence of structure made it nearly impossible to draw firm conclusions. What can be said with confidence is limited, and that limitation has been deeply uncomfortable for those who want narrative closure. Elizabeth was last seen alive in public, in a crowded place appearing ordinary. There is no verified evidence that she left the Biltmore with a known associate. There is no reliable witness who can place her with a specific individual after that point. The transition from life to death happened offstage, in private, beyond the reach of record. This gap has invited projection. Over the years, writers, investigators, and theorists have filled it with imagined encounters and reconstructed conversations. Some of these reconstructions are detailed and persuasive. None of them can be verified. The temptation to resolve uncertainty by invention is powerful, especially in a case that has resisted resolution for decades. What is often overlooked is how this uncertainty reflects the reality of Elizabeth Short's life. She moved through the city lightly. She left few traces. She depended on short-term arrangements that did not generate records. This invisibility was not accidental. It was a survival tactic in a world that punished women for visibility and vulnerability. Elizabeth did not vanish dramatically. She did not announce a final journey. She did not leave behind a clear trail that could be followed cleanly. She disappeared the way many marginalized people do, quietly, between places, without witnesses who understood the significance of what they were seeing. That disappearance has been treated as suspicious in itself. The implication is that she must have done something wrong to end up unaccounted for. This logic reverses responsibility. It blames the structure of her life for the violence done to her. In examining Elizabeth Short's final days, the most honest conclusion is also the most unsettling. We do not know where she went. We do not know who she trusted. We do not know when she realized she was in danger, or if she did at all. The record does not fail because she was careless. It fails because her life existed in spaces that were never designed to be documented. In the next chapter, we will step back from the timeline and examine what happened after her death to her reputation, how newspapers, police leaks, and cultural anxiety reshaped Elizabeth Short into the Black Dahlia, and how that transformation has obscured the person she actually was. Chapter 5. What happened to Elizabeth Short after her death may be as consequential as what happened to her before it. Once her body was discovered, control over her story passed almost immediately into other hands. Police, reporters, editors, and readers all participated in a rapid transformation. A young woman with a fragmented, precarious life was flattened into a single sensationalized identity, the Black Dahlia. This transformation did not occur accidentally. It followed familiar patterns of mid-century crime reporting, particularly when the victim was a young woman without wealth, status, or powerful advocates. Newspapers did not simply report facts. They interpreted, embellished, and moralized. In doing so, they created a version of Elizabeth Short that served narrative and cultural needs far better than it served truth. Early reporting emphasized sexuality without evidence. Headlines hinted at promiscuity. Articles speculated about her relationships, her morals, her supposed ambitions. The absence of clear information about her work or housing was reframed as evidence of deviance rather than instability. Her mobility was treated as recklessness. Her reliance on acquaintances was treated as manipulation. Each gap in the record became an opportunity to assign blame. Police leaks played a role in this process, whether motivated by frustration, rivalry, or a desire to appear forthcoming. Investigators allowed selective details to reach the press. These details were rarely contextualized. Forensic findings were stripped of nuance. Unverified rumors were allowed to circulate unchecked. Once printed, these claims acquired the weight of fact, even when they were later contradicted or quietly abandoned. The nickname itself, the Black Dahlia, was central to this process. It detached Elizabeth Short from her ordinary humanity and recast her as a symbol. The name evoked darkness, mystery, and sexual danger. It suggested that the crime was an extension of her identity rather than an act imposed upon her. This framing made the violence easier to consume and easier to rationalize. Elizabeth's own voice was entirely absent from this reconstruction. Letters she wrote were selectively quoted or paraphrased. Statements from people who knew her casually were elevated over those from people who knew her well. Contradictions were ignored if they interfered with a more compelling narrative. Complexity was sacrificed for coherence. The consequences of this distortion were profound. Once Elizabeth Short was defined primarily through insinuation, investigative focus shifted subtly but decisively. She was treated less as a victim in need of justice and more as a puzzle whose solution lay in her supposed behavior. Questions about who harmed her were entangled with judgments about how she lived. This blurred the line between explanation and justification. Over time, this narrative hardened. Books, films, and documentaries repeated early claims without re-examining their origins. Speculation ossified into lore. Elizabeth Short became a fixed character rather than a historical person. Each retelling pushed her further from reality and deeper into myth. This process also protected institutions. By framing the crime as the inevitable result of a dangerous lifestyle, attention was deflected away from investigative failures, structural vulnerabilities, and the broader conditions that made violence against women both possible and dismissible. The story reassured the public that this was an exceptional case, not a systemic one. What remains decades later is a cautionary example of how easily a victim can be overwritten. Elizabeth Short's life was complex, constrained, and unfinished. Reducing it to a morality play does not explain her death. It obscures it. In the next chapter, we will confront this legacy directly. We will examine how later investigators, writers, and theorists have tried to reclaim Elizabeth Short from myth, and how difficult it is to disentangle truth from a story that was distorted almost from the moment it began. Chapter 6. By the time the initial frenzy subsided, Elizabeth Short no longer belonged to history alone. She belonged to interpretation. Every gap in the record invited someone to fill it, and over the decades, those fillings hardened into competing versions of the truth. Some were offered in good faith. Others were driven by ego, profit, or the seductive promise of being the one who finally solved the Black Dahlia. Later investigators approached the case carrying the weight of everything that had already been said. This was their first obstacle. They were not starting with evidence. They were starting with sediment. Decades of assumptions layered over primary sources, early police missteps, and journalistic invention. Separating original material from repeated error became an act of archaeology. Some researchers attempted to restore Elizabeth Short's humanity by stripping away the more salacious claims. They returned to birth records, letters, military files, and contemporaneous interviews. What emerged from this work was not a sensational figure, but a familiar one. A young woman shaped by illness, abandonment, and economic precarity. Someone whose life made sense once it was placed in the context of post-war America rather than post-mortem fantasy. Others moved in the opposite direction. They leaned into spectacle, proposing elaborate theories that centered less on Elizabeth and more on the supposed brilliance or pathology of her killer. These narratives often treated the crime as a kind of intellectual challenge, something to be cracked through pattern recognition and intuition. In doing so, they repeated the same mistake made in 1947. They replaced a person with a puzzle. This tension between reclamation and exploitation has defined the Black Dahlia discourse ever since. Every attempt to clarify Elizabeth Short's life competes with an industry built on mystery. Books promise answers they cannot deliver. Documentaries dramatize uncertainty as revelation. The case becomes perpetually new, even as the underlying facts remain stubbornly unchanged. What is often lost in these debates is how little room Elizabeth Short is given within them. She appears as a starting point, rarely as a center. Her life is treated as context, rather than content. Even sympathetic portrayals struggle to escape the gravitational pull of the murder itself. Yet, when her life is examined on its own terms, without the need for narrative payoff, a different picture emerges. Elizabeth Short was not enigmatic. She was constrained. She was not unknowable. She was underdocumented. Her apparent contradictions dissolve once her circumstances are understood. Illness limited her work. Poverty limited her housing. Gender limited her options. None of this requires mystery to explain. The difficulty of reclaiming Elizabeth Short from myth reveals something uncomfortable about true crime itself. Stories persist not because they are accurate, but because they are useful. The Black Dahlia has endured because it accommodates projection. It allows society to explore violence, desire, and failure without confronting the structures that enable them. Elizabeth Short's life resists this use. It does not resolve neatly. It does not justify what happened to her. It does not offer a satisfying moral. That resistance is precisely why her story has been overwritten so many times. In the next chapter, we will step back from interpretation and return to impact. We will examine how Elizabeth Short's case changed Los Angeles, shaped policing, influenced crime reporting, and became a template for how female victims would be framed for generations. Not as an abstract symbol, but as a real consequence of a real life cut short. Elizabeth Short did not become history by choice. She became history because others would not let her remain simply human. Chapter 7. By the late 1940s, Elizabeth Short's name had already begun to function as something larger than the person it once belonged to. The Black Dahlia was no longer simply a case. It was a reference point. It became shorthand for a particular kind of fear, a particular kind of violence, and a particular kind of failure. In that transformation, Elizabeth Short's life exerted influence far beyond its brief duration. Los Angeles changed after her death, though not always in ways that were publicly acknowledged. The city's self-image took a blow. The idea that extreme violence could occur quietly, behind closed doors, and then be displayed without consequence, unsettled a population already grappling with post-war instability. Trust in institutions weakened. Confidence in police competence was shaken. The realization that a killer could exploit both media attention and investigative weakness lingered long after headlines faded. Crime reporting changed as well. The Black Dahlia case reinforced a model that prioritized sensation over restraint. Graphic detail, moral judgment, and narrative flourish became normalized, especially when the victim was a woman without social power. Elizabeth Short's treatment set a template. Future cases would follow the same pattern. Victims would be scrutinized as closely as perpetrators. Personal history would be mined for implication. Violence would be framed as spectacle rather than harm. Policing absorbed lessons too, though unevenly. The failures exposed by the case influenced later reforms in evidence handling, media relations, and interdepartmental coordination. These changes came slowly and often without direct reference to Elizabeth Short, but the shadow of the Black Dahlia lingered. The case became a cautionary example taught indirectly, through policy adjustments rather than public reckoning. Culturally, the Black Dahlia took on a life of its own. Fiction, film, and art returned to the case repeatedly, each iteration adding another layer of distance between Elizabeth Short and the person she had been. These retellings often emphasized mystery and menace while stripping away context. The result was a feedback loop. The more the story was retold, the more fixed and distorted it became. What is striking is how little this cultural afterlife depended on new information. The same limited facts were reused, rearranged, and dramatized endlessly. Elizabeth Short's life did not need to be understood to sustain interest. Her death alone proved sufficient. This imbalance reveals something uncomfortable about the stories societies choose to preserve. When Elizabeth Short is remembered today, it is rarely as a woman navigating illness, poverty, and instability in post-war America. She is remembered as an image, A name, a case. The distance between that memory and the reality of her life is the space where myth thrives. Episode 2 has been an attempt to narrow that distance. Not to solve the crime, not to offer closure, but to restore proportion. Elizabeth Short was not a symbol first, she was a person first. Her vulnerability was not a personal failing. It was the result of structural forces that shaped many lives like hers and left them unprotected. Understanding Elizabeth Short does not explain her murder. It does something more important. It resists the impulse to treat violence as inevitable or deserved. It challenges the idea that mystery excuses erasure. In the next episode, we return to the investigation itself, but with clearer ground beneath us. Episode 3 will examine Los Angeles in 1947 as a system. The LAPD structure, internal corruption, political pressure, media influence, and how all of it created an environment where a crime like this could occur, be mishandled, and remain unresolved. Elizabeth Short's life was not unknowable. The system meant to protect her was. That is where the story goes next.